Today we are looking at a Paper 1 Edexcel A-Level Economics 25 marker question, which reads, evaluate the microeconomic effects of rising energy bills on the hotel industry or on an industry of your choice. So hotel industry is interesting. I think I'm sort of comfortable with that. I almost feel like I'm interested in doing electric cars though. Like the electric car industry is kind of interesting, potentially. We're going to go with two knowledge analysis application paragraphs. Each of them is going to have fairly chunky evaluation because this is a 25 marker and we're going to have a conclusion. So we want sort of two core things that we're going to look at and analyze. I think I would look at sort of how businesses are faring, so business costs and profitability. That naturally, from a knowledge standpoint, is going to make me look at probably cost curve diagram. It looks a bit like this. So that for my knowledge marks. What else could we talk about beyond just business costs? Rising energy bills on the hotel industry. Could this affect market concentration? Potentially, right? So if you have rising costs of production, maybe that prices certain companies out of the industry. Maybe it sort of forces consolidation as certain businesses go out of business. So we can talk about the effects of that. That does feel a little bit indirect. Or on an industry of your choice, we could talk about how costs are going to be passed on to the consumer. I kind of feel like I want to talk about that as a part of business costs and profitability. Increase from 2,000 to 8,000 per month. Small businesses do not have energy management teams of larger companies to negotiate better deals. Okay, so we want to focus on kind of small businesses. Yeah, maybe we will look at market concentration. Maybe this is an interesting topic of conversation. And this has the added benefit of allowing us to look at maybe an oligopoly diagram. From a market concentration standpoint, we could look at the oligopoly diagram if we're arguing that these smaller companies maybe will go out of business and that will increase market concentration. So what's our analysis here for the first topic? Well, I think it's pretty clear. Like energy bills we probably want to talk about from a definition standpoint, maybe fixed versus variable costs. For something like a hotel, this is a relatively fixed cost, right? Because although the energy usage is going to go up a little bit when you have guests versus not, for the most part, you're having to have the lights on in your building either way. So this is increasing fixed costs for the business. And so that's interesting, right? Potentially marginal costs as well, but it's certainly primarily going to increase the average cost curve on this diagram. It's the average cost curve on the diagram. What does that mean? Like, what kind of an effect is that going to have? Specifically because it's fixed costs, this could go one of two ways, right? Perhaps this pushes companies towards needing to increase their production, needing to have more guests, because this is going to raise the break-even point for businesses. Right, there's more of an upfront fixed cost that needs to be paid down. So either this is going to lead us to, in the first instance, maybe certain hotels might increase their production / sales in an attempt to cover this increased fixed cost. But secondarily, this puts certain companies at risk of going out of business, right? Okay, interesting kind of analysis. Is there anything else we should add to kind of beef this up, right? So we're talking about like, what is this conditional on? That's always a good way to kind of develop analysis. And it's also a good way to evaluate, right? So what are maybe our evaluations for why this might not have the effect that we're describing, right? So, well, one part of this is maybe the difference between hotels that are in a position to increase their production versus companies that are at risk of going out of business, right? So the difference is perhaps brand differentiation, right? Why would this matter? Because brand differentiation creates a less price elastic customer base, which therefore means that companies can raise prices to pass costs on to the consumer rather than, so here we're talking about sort of consumer versus business surplus, rather than bearing those costs themselves. I don't want to talk too much about this like smaller companies going out of business, I think, because that's going to be part of our market concentration argument. We are setting that up a little bit. What else might affect, which companies are most likely to be affected by this? I guess hotels in places that have more heating needs, colder climates. I don't think that's like the best argument in the world. I do think we could talk a little bit in our application about specifically the hotel industry and like why this is a particular problem for them, right? So like hotels have common spaces that need to be lit and heated regardless of how many occupants there are. So this is just kind of underlying why this is a fixed cost for hotels, why this is something that like, no matter how many employees you have, you can't choose to have, even if only one of your rooms is occupied, you can't choose to shut the heating off in the rest of the rooms. Otherwise the building as a whole is too cold, right? So obviously you're more likely to be this kind of a seasonal vulnerability here. I don't know that that's interesting in the sense that like you just do more heating during the winter, stuff like that. I think we also talk about like smaller businesses do not have financial economies of scale. So just slipping some vocabulary in here, right? But the idea is for smaller hotels, it's going to be harder for them to, one, negotiate better deals like they're discussing here, but also you maybe can't get access to the credit that you need to cover these costs in the short term. So we're now more vulnerable to these costs due to a lack of credit, potentially, right? You're a smaller business, you're not in a position to negotiate a good interest rate on, if you want to borrow the money to cover this cost. So I think this is a reasonably well-developed point, right? You've got your diagram, we've got some vocabulary. Let's have a look at this market concentration argument. I think this is kind of interesting. So the argument is, based on stuff we've already talked about, certain businesses, smaller ones, are at great risk of going under because they cannot increase sales/production to offset higher fixed costs. Therefore, sustained high prices will drive will drive a lot of hotels out of business and may make them vulnerable to takeovers, right? So we're talking here about, maybe a lot of these properties get acquired. We know hotels are really vulnerable to this during COVID. Lots of sort of smaller boutique hotels shut down just because they didn't have the cash to sustain this sort of period where they had no customers. What then is the result of this, right? So just pointing out these going out of business is not that interesting, but we get into this position of sort of the kinked demand curve, where this makes collusion on price for consumers, that the price is passed on to consumers, easier as there are fewer players in the market. As in, the more competitive and the more diverse a market is, the more likely it is that you get undercut on price if you're trying to set abnormally high prices. So the argument is if you remove these, this makes collusion on price for customers easier as there are fewer players in the market, and therefore this means higher costs for those consumers, eating into the consumer surplus. Okay. And, there's also supernormal profit. We can talk about that as well. Basically, a lot of the standard analysis that we can provide as part of an open argument, you could talk about that here. What would our evaluation be? What's the sort of counter argument for this? Well, for one, like as in counter argument, as in we're trying to sort of moderate this effect, right? Well, for one, hotels with a distinct advantage, with a distinct identity may be able to charge customers more. They're obviously not going to have the benefit of the sort of financial economies of scale and such. What we could say is hotels are a non-essential good. Therefore, even if suitable substitutes do not exist, consumers may choose not to go on holiday, which creates some pressure against excessive price setting, right? This is different, or it's a little bit different from a market like oil or gas, right? Where you have to fill your car with petrol to go to work, and therefore you can more or less charge what you want if you're in a monopoly position in that kind of market. Here, even if you were in a perfect monopoly situation, consumers still have the option just not to go on holiday, just not to stay at hotels. Maybe they have alternatives like Airbnbs that might be more resistant to this. So that actually might be something to discuss here. We now have more alternatives, substitute goods, right? Use our vocab, beyond what we're used to having, right? So like this is like Airbnb, it's like hostels. It's also like you could talk about staying with friends and family or going on maybe closer to home holidays, right? Camping, stuff like that, right? Because we have more of these substitute goods, right, which are not the same thing. It's not the same thing as a hotel, but it's an alternative. Maybe again that creates, despite the concentration, it creates a little bit of pressure not to charge the craziest prices in the world. I think overall the picture is fairly clear though. Like this is going to be bad for consumers, and I would probably write my conclusion along those lines, which is like, how is this going to affect the hotel industry? It's clearly going to hurt profit margins. It will hurt consumers and smaller hotels, right? I think this is not a super controversial. Sometimes there's like a really complex thing to weigh up in terms of a trade-off. I think it's reasonably clear what's going to happen in this case. We can talk about maybe some of the mitigating factors. I would maybe focus my conclusion on like effects on, consumers and why it's bad for them individually, right? So do a little bit more analysis into that, I think would be good in the conclusion.